All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Natalie from UXPin, and I'm glad that you can make it. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. The topic today is holistic design operations. Before we get started, I wanted to call your attention to the Q&A feature in Zoom. This is where you can pose your questions for Dave. And our team will aggregate your questions during the presentation. So definitely upvote the most interesting ones and we'll post them to Dave at the end. After the webinar, please do stick around for a bit. We'll give you a quick glimpse into how you can improve your design ops process with UXPin. Okay, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce to you Dave Malouf. He's the Director of Design Operations at Teladoc Health. And with further ado, I'll turn it over to the star of the show. Dave, take it away.
Thank you, Natalie. And thanks everyone from all the time zones showing up. It's really great to see such a diverse crowd of folks. So thank you everybody for coming. And I know it said that we're going to talk about holistic design operations, but what I really am gonna, so maybe you might consider this a little bait and switch. What we're really going to talk about is operating in the horizontal. But what do we mean by horizontal? And what if there's a horizontal, then there has to be a vertical, and how do we demark what is horizontal and what is vertical, and is there only one way that this happens? And we'll get into some of this and some of the different ways that happens. The first thing I want to talk about is, well, what is design operations? And I know that many people know what design operation is from their perspective, or have heard it, or have read stuff, or whatever. But I just want us to all start for, alignment purposes. At a place where we can all be together on the same thing. And for me, design operations has three major components, and lots of things come in threes, and a lot of people talk about things in threes. So I'm going to go with that. The first piece that I talk about is delivery operations. It's the processes, it's the programs that usually make up the bulk of what we're focused on, and is usually one of the first places that most design operations start on. And it's focused on optimizing, on efficiency, velocity, cost reduction, how to get things delivered, right, from A to B. The next piece that I really like, that I come to design operations for, is practice operations. This is where the people, the spaces, the methods, the tools that make design happen. And I like to think that practice operations focuses on quality, community, and an engaged team. So the focus really here is on those three areas. So the last area is business operations. Business operations has no fancy pictures. It's really everything that no one wants to talk about. It's all of the corporate bull, dare I say, that we all have to deal with. This is the finance, the IT, the procurement, the regulatory and compliant, the legal, everything that no one wants to talk about. So that's design operations. Now, when we talk about this, and to keep it real, these all three things are entwined together. And that's great. And they all affect each other. And you can't do one area more than you can do another area without it kind of falling apart. They all sort of help each other. And like this Havdalah candle, the braids kind of help each other get brighter, right? The flame is stronger because of them being all braided together in that way. Now, This is all well and good, except that sometimes we create silos. And sometimes these silos get in the way of us doing really good work. We do have to manage work in individual work streams. This project, this program, this portfolio, these are just ever widening silos, right? So I have my project, I have a group of projects that make up a program, and then I have a group of programs that make up a portfolio of programs, right? And it's just the same silo that just keeps getting wider and wider. But for many of us, as we begin to scale, this starts to create problems. Our foundations begin to slip, and the towers and the silos start to lean, right? In terms of our work, as we keep creating these silos and placing in those silos, the practices start to disintegrate. Consistency, coherency, quality, community, engagement, even optimization, efficiency, and speed begin to degrade. Peter Merholtz, for example, was noting that these embedded workstream systems actually limit our ability to grow people. Invariably, we lose the ability to maintain the supporting structures of a holistic design practice as we focus on these verticals. This is why we can't only do one of these pieces of operations. A sole focus on delivery doesn't scale, same with a sole focus on practice, and obviously with business operations. But this version of the vertical horizontal divide is an obvious one, right? Like we know this, like we know that we have to have delivery and practice, whatever the names are that you give them, right? And we need to connect those things somehow. Where it is harder is in the space where the model of the project program portfolio-based silos can't be mapped to the realities of the people for whom we're designing. And this is the big challenge that scaling and design practices are facing today. What does this look like? Well, let's take an example of where we can be familiar with, which is our finances. As our financial lives get more and more complex, as we grow, as we start having different life cycle changes in our lives, we start to branch out, requiring more and different types of services. Institutions want you, the customer, to use them for all of these services. And they want all of your money. They want all of your money. So they have checking and savings services, credit cards, investments, loans and mortgages, life insurance. Oh my, they just have more and more. And as financial institutions have become more and more deregulated, this has actually grown in terms of process. Now, this may all seem like a really simple thing to solve with, some architectural processes, right? We can just use architecture to solve this. We can create platform layers. We can have design systems. We can have more core reusable components, common branding, and that will just all make it good, right? If we can just put the electrical, plumbing, HVAC, carpentry, etc., all on the same image, it would just be great, right? It's actually not that far from the truth. However, the problem isn't about a technical mapping solution. The problem is people, the person. And that's the issue that I want to discuss, because when it comes down to it, what we love about being digital product designers is we get to think about the people and enable people to be the best and create the most meaningful experiences for themselves. So how does this person's point of view get pushed through all of those applications, products, and service verticals? Well, I was recently working at a major financial institution, actually a life insurance company. And during my time there, we found this problem gets amplified as we began to integrate our platforms together more and more. This wasn't just a design problem by any stretch of the imagination. This was a service management issue. But as the designs organization mandate included owning the human behavioral point of view, we took on the responsibility to finding a solution. Notice I didn't say we solved it by ourselves. This is definitely a group effort, a collaborative effort that required everyone on deck to be part of the village solving the problem. So how do we solve it? You know, most of us have done journey mapping or service blueprints before. So, you know, there's those things, right? Well, we had to now take a look at scale, silos, bridges, people. And we found that while we had the platform and components and architecture to build upon, our real problem stemmed from a lack of operations to allow us to get the human narrative entwined with the practice and programs that allowed us to move the narrative from design intent to design execution. Basically, we were back at silos again. And the core of this problem is indeed that the silos and the people that inhabit those silos, quite honestly, are also maintaining those silos. While we had some bridges in the technical sense, there were few bridges connecting the different silos at the operational and, more importantly, at the narrative level. So what we discovered is that people were wearing blinders. They were incentivized, they were measuring things from the point of view of the silo that they belong to. And that's really how silos get to be maintained so much, is that kind of operational element that's part of it. So how do we then change the operational model to be able to create connection points at the narrative level from the user's perspective and make them come to life? So they had their own agendas, and they were good agendas. They were filled with human data points of their own. So they felt emboldened to their understanding of truth from the view that they had. And usually the way that this gets solved is with a teams of teams model. And that's a very common way. If we just keep creating these pyramids of connected things where you have the working teams, and then you have tribes, and then you have whatever comes above a tribe, right? You can put those all together. Well, it doesn't quite work that way, because the problem of this approach is all these teams are focused more on the delivery than on the narrative creation. And like I said, yes, they did do research, generative research, and thus they had discovery tracks that they were using. Their focus of this research was always verticalized. So think of it this way. If you were doing a checking account, you would be doing discovery around what's the best way to deposit a check. Now, I realize globally checks might not be a thing anymore, so it doesn't really work for everybody. But think of it as like you're trying to do money transfer. What's the best way to do money transfer? And you'll do an exploration of money transfer from one point to another, to all these different ways. But you're really in the how do I transfer money from one account to one person to another account to another person. It's verticalized. What we wanted to look at, though, was not how to just transfer money. What we wanted to look at was what is the relationship that people have to money, and how do they understand money in an electronic medium? That's a really different kind of more foundational question that impacts all of the verticals way beyond checking and savings and goes into investment and insurance and things like that. That wasn't happening, and that connection wasn't happening. And that's what I mean by the verticals were sort of maintaining themselves, even when they were trying to do really good human research. So what we wanted to think about was a new kind of bridge. So for those of us who live near water, sometimes we have these things that aren't really bridges, they're more like causeways, and they connect multiple islands. And so that's what we wanted to do. We didn't want to just create a bridge. We wanted to create a pathway that connected multiple verticals, not just single verticals. And we wanted to figure out how that bridge can be focused on the people and not just on the delivery that needed to happen. The biggest part of this was communications. How do we communicate across these journeys? How do we sort of make those happen? And so The traditional way was this top-down hierarchical thing, especially in a financial institution, which has a lot of top-down culture that's engaged in it. We wanted to avoid that because, quite honestly, it doesn't really work because it demotivates people and it reduces engagement. And we wanted to increase engagement. We wanted to keep people empowered as much as possible. So we needed to find a new way of communicating these things. When I say new, somebody sort of said, well, isn't this just service design? And that's at the crux of this. And I agree with it. Service design is at the crux, but it's the beginning. And you'll see sort of where where I'm going with this and where we took traditional service design and we amped it up a bit. So from that perspective, we needed to find a way in terms of communicating is not just visualize things, not just connect the data, but create an evolving and collaborative system around those narratives. So that single point of expression of the narrative also had to do these 4 things at the same time. So we created a new tool in order to do that. We also created a new team structure that operationalized how it is to work on this. So the first thing that we did is we built a tool from scratch. And the tool from scratch was built around these parent journeys that we called them. And each one of these that we were working on had its own team, a journey team that was engaged in it. It sort of was the beginning of the structure. But as you sort of went further on, you would then go into more of a journey map. Now, this looks like a traditional journey map in many ways. Obviously, there's more to it than that, right? And when you really think of it, is based on that. You have the swim lanes across front stage and backstage and support stage. You have pathways that are being created and modes of communication and channels all being put into there at the same time. But we did one more thing as part of this. What we did was we added metadata to it. So if we had metadata to it and a lot of metadata to it, it becomes a whole new system that really differentiates a flat journey map to something that can be used by the entire team and can be used to communicate why we're making the decisions that we're making that spoke to the delivery teams as well as the business to help us do prioritization and make decisions better. So one is adding this metadata. I know this image might be hard to see, but some of the metadata here is links to some of the work that's in here, insights, metrics that the teams are going to be looking at as the journey develops, and then what are some of the opportunity spaces that are because of this link that we can be looking at. And we can then track each one of these through this mapping as we're working. The next part is that it's collaborative, right? That the map itself isn't just a static form that's printed on a wall, but it's dynamic and can move and evolve. And 2 areas that of evolving that really made a difference to this is in one visualization, you can capture current states and multiple proposed future states so that you can see them together, you can see where change is happening, and you can sort of prioritize which areas of change were going to be done before other areas of change. And because of the metadata that you placed on these artifacts, you can then start looking at, well, what does success look like based on some of the metadata, especially the metrics that are involved. And the other piece of this is that we made sure that there were different roles. So there were the people who were the creators of these maps, people who were collaborators, and people who were just straight up reviewers who were usually more at the executive level or in the periphery of cross-functional team players. Now, the piece that we need to start working on here is delivery. And this is the complicated piece to all of this, right? This is the complicated piece in terms of getting decisions to be made in a way that then drive to the delivery teams, which is the whole point. So what we did was we began to take each journey, and like I said, each journey was a team, and we paired each journey with a design program manager that worked both with that journey and the delivery portfolio most associated with that journey. So if something came up from the journey perspective that worked in that portfolio, that's great. That makes sense. It's kind of a top-down approach. However, many times what came up from a journey impacted more than one portfolio. Well, what we discovered was if that person who had that relationship with the journey team used their close relationships with all the other design program managers across all of the delivery teams, then we would be able to do a better job of communicating not just downward, but across the journey narratives to the delivery teams in a much more clear and articulate way. And so the design program management practice became this causeway that connected all of the vertical islands and silos that were there. In essence, we created that bridge that then broke the silos apart. And so the structure here that we had is we had one DPM who was the lead DPM focused on the journey work. There was lots of work to be doing, right? And the DPMs then also were on delivery. So one DPM was focused on journey. They also had their own delivery team, but a smaller one. And then we had 4 or 5 DPMs that were focused on deliveries, but also communicated to their journey teams as well. Now, as we work on this, the greatest design and product problem that still needs, this isn't done by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot more work that needs to take place. This is just at the beginning, and unfortunately, I needed to leave that team and move on to my new responsibilities. And so I didn't really see how it all played out, and we didn't really have enough time to see it evolve in that time. And since then, my thinking has kind of changed. And now that I'm in healthcare and looking at this from another lens, that there's new opportunities and maybe a different metaphor for us to think about the operational relationships between people and groups, right? And what I'm thinking of is a new metaphor around clouds. And the reason that I'm thinking about clouds is that they seem to have more flexibility. Whereas when we think about structural elements like silos and platforms and bridges and pyramids, they're very static and very rigid, right? But in reality, we need to create systems that are more fluid and overlapping and spatial. And I'd like to look at this reality more, and I'd like to get help from others around this and figure out together as a community if we can pull this forward and move it further. So that's what I wanted to share with you all. I know that went by pretty quick, but what I really would love to do is start a conversation, answer people's questions, and just take this as a community moving forward. So thank you. And yeah, that's it.
Dave, amazing presentation. The chat is blowing off. Everyone is really intrigued in the topic today, and they're enjoying your presentation and talk. So first of all, thank you again. That was great. And everyone loved your thoughts and your experiences. So with all the questions submitted. I'll go ahead and ask a few here, if that's okay. Are you
Sure.
ready? Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right. The first question here is, how is design operations different from service design? Some people say design ops is service design applied to the design organization. Will you agree with this?
I'm one of the people who've said that. So I think there's two parts to design operations. One is the creation of design operations. And from that perspective, when you go into a team and you are going in and creating and managing design operations, it's very much service design, right? That process it has front stage, it has backstage, and you're working those systems and services, and you are creating or recreating or designing the design service for an organization, more or less. But it's not alone by any stretch of the imagination. And then the second part of it is, well, you're just managing the service. You're not designing it anymore, you're just running it. And so that's the next part of it. But yeah, you could say that work is very much service design oriented, and I use that perspective all the time in my work.
Nice. That's amazing that you were the one that said that as well.
Not the only one, just a person.
Yeah. Follow-up question to that. What are your thoughts on leveraging other disciplines, frameworks into design ops, like systems thinking and change management, et cetera?
Well, you can't do anything without change management, for sure. And I find that a lot of change management really comes down to strong communications, and making sure you have clarity around where you are and where you're going, and communicating that along the way the whole time. I think a lot of change problems that occur in any kind of change environment is when people don't do that, is when they say, hey, let's just do X, and they don't really manage the change at all, communicate it, visualize it, make it clear, things like that. In terms of systems, it is a system, and it's a part of that. I think it's not so complex that you need to go all the way up into like higher level systems work. I think it's simpler. It really is more at the service level. You don't need to go up higher than that.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question that we have here is, what metrics do you track to measure design ops success?
I've used a bunch of different ones. It's usually not one metric. So when I think about design operations and its job in terms of increasing the value of a design team, the first thing you need to figure out in your organization is, how is your organization valuing design? And then how do you measure that value? And so every organization is going to be slightly different in that regard. And so each organization that I work with, I use different metrics. In some organizations, it's really simple, where you can just measure something like NPS, and that's the value, some kind of, trailing thing like that. But how does that connect to operations? And what I might do is connect time spent designing to NPS, right? So time spent designing is an operational impact that I have. So I'm going to say, I want to increase the time that my designers spend designing versus time spent doing non-design activities. And if I can increase that amount of time, is there a correlation, a clear correlation to an increase of quality of the experience of people? You can do that with NPS, you can do that with other kinds of satisfaction metrics, you can do that with cognitive walkthrough heuristic changes, you can do that with usability sus kind of metrics, you can do that with a heart framework, however you want. But the idea is connect an operational thing to a value thing of some kind. And those are the metrics that we track.
That's a great answer. And that makes so much sense as well. Following up with metrics. Well, I think you mentioned some of those tools. Sorry. How do you, okay. What is a tool you use for journeys and metadata? And how do you ensure this is kept updated? How do you ensure that it's updated?
Yeah, so I felt really lucky in my previous role where we decided that we were going to create our own tool. And so the screenshots that you saw is a custom tool. It's the property of that organization. And we looked at, before we decided to build it, we said, well, what can we buy? What can we use? What can we integrate with? And yeah, we looked at various journey mapping tools that exist, and there are some that are out there. What we found lacking from those was some of the things that you saw around the metadata connection points. What we were looking at doing was connecting the journey map tool to other tools that were the journey map tool that we created. We wanted to connect to other tools. The tools that we were looking at connecting to were like Smartsheet for and or Airtable for like insight management and metrics management and things like that. And we also were looking at how can we connect the journey to tools like Jira and using APIs and stuff to make those connections. We didn't quite get there yet in the journey, but you definitely will need more than one tool in order to do it right. And I think that's the point, is no one tool will rule it all to make this operationally work.
Gotcha. We have so many more questions. I think I'll ask about 3 more. And so the next question that I have for you here is, as an organization gets to the higher ends of design maturity, where design is infused as part of the culture, not just a separate design group, how does design operations evolve? Does it become more of a generic operational discipline? Thoughts on that?
I haven't worked in such an organization, so I have no idea. I don't know. You know, to me, it's the description of that organization feels like science fiction to me. So I haven't lived in that utopia. I haven't gotten there.
So on the other spectrum, how would you apply this to much smaller teams when you don't have some of the organization capacities that you did mention a little earlier?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think like the thing that I would always keep in mind whenever dealing with smaller organizations versus larger organization is it's about intentionality, right? And I think as you are scaling, are you keeping the narrative in the center, right? What are you keeping in the center of the conversation as you scale? And for me, the human narrative is what we need to keep center in an organization if we're ever going to get to that utopia, right? And so that to me is where you start and make the intentionality around that. That's the way that's the takeaway I would say for any organization. That's sort of the point, is can we drive towards that center? Right now, I feel very far away from that compared to that vision of the design as infused through an organization vision. So,
yeah, and I see more and more teams kind of working towards human-centered design, and I love hearing that. Mm-hmm. And I think for the last question that we have here for today is, in envisioning of multiple possible futures, where can you address the impact of that future on desired outcomes? I can repeat that again.
No, I actually see that question. It's from Alan. So it's a great question, and I'm honestly going to say I don't have a clear answer for it. I think another way of maybe reframing that question is, how do you compare one future to another future, right? Like in this multiverse that we're creating, envisioning, right? Like how do we create a comparative across those so that we can know which one would be better? And I think like one element of this is it's not so clear, right? It's every decision point creates like a break-off path, and we were looking at matrix at the moment piece, not for the whole journey itself. So I think like that's one element. It's really hard to do a matrix for an entire journey. There's just too many places and they're too like segmented. So we were able to compare like the metrics, the desired outcomes at a moment's, and in that moment, all the different versions of that moment. But we weren't able to take it to the level of the change of collection of moments, because you may change a moment here, but not change a moment here, but then also change it here. And so that it's very difficult to, all the permutations are difficult to manage.
Okay. Fun question. Thank you, Dave. Well, that sums up the our talk with Dave. Dave, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time with us today, and your presentation and your talk was so insightful. And I just really love your holistic and human approach to design operations. So thank you so much again. Before transitioning to the quick UXPin show and tell, I would like to invite you all to the Design Value Conference. It's coming up on March 29th. We have invited top industry leaders from companies like Uber, Amazon, and PayPal to share their experience on scaling design and improving ROI. So we'll put the register link in the chat, and we hope to see you there. So with that, I'm gonna now go ahead and move into the UXPin demo here for those that are sticking around, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, let's get started here. So for those of you who are not familiar with UXPin, we were designed by designers to solve our own collaboration challenges. And we initially started as a paper product. Now we're a digital platform, and we help teams create and collaborate in one place. So everyone can participate in the design in UXPin. And here are some of the industry leaders that are designing in UXPin. And we are a full stack design tool. So you can use it from your early exploration phases all the way to scaling with a design system. And so UXPin is a code-based design tool. So that's one of the biggest differences between the other design tools in the market. When you're designing in UXPin, you're actually designing in code, although it looks very similar to the UI of other design tools. It allows you to add powerful advanced interactions to your prototypes to really get that feeling of what it looks like at the end in the browser in the end product without having it to be actually coded. And you can really close the loop between your design and development process in UXPin. And so this is the typical flow that you may be familiar with. Like Dave mentioned, there are those silos that exist. And UXPin improves this process by shortening that, eliminating the silos, and allowing teams to work with code-based design so that you're not pixel pushing, and that can be really expensive. And so we've also introduced Merge. It's a feature that's within UXPin. And Merge allows UI code to be leveraged inside the visual editor. And so I'll show you today that your UI code gets translated into the graphical elements in UXPin's editor. And that can be manipulated in the component properties. And so I'll walk you through that today. But Merge really allows your design and development teams to speak the same language by using the same exact components. Yes, so by adding with Merge, we're bringing in the development team into the design process so that we can collaborate much earlier on. All right, and let me go ahead and now jump into a few examples of UXPin, and then from there, I'll jump into the editor. So what you're seeing here is our classic UXPin. You can make components that are interactive and feel like a real accordion here. So you don't need to have any coding knowledge to be able to build something like this in the UI of UXPin. We have real HTML input fields that you can interact with. So it's not just boxes or anything static. We can come here and we can type in an email address. If I type it incorrectly, you have the capabilities of adding conditional interactions. So an if and then statement. Here we say if it's missing an @ show an error. And then once we add that, that error will disappear. Same with the password, you can add requirements for it. So if it's too short, again, we'll have a state that mentions this, you need more than 8 characters. Then that can take us to the next state. We can use variables to bring in data that's entered by the user to show in another state or page. And here we have a pop-up where you can just hide that. And the last example here that I want to show you is expressions. So this is one of the advanced capabilities and interactions that you can add. You can add mathematical equations to manipulate the prototype. So as you can see, the count is changing as well as the total. And on the topic of scaling, we do offer the ability to add design systems so that you can manage your design systems in UXPin and also access all the pieces of your design system directly from the editor. All right, so the differences between, I'm going to show you the differences between classic UXPin and UXPin with Merge. So UXPin has a preview link that you can share with any stakeholder, and they'll be able to simulate through it. So I'm in the preview link here. We can see that this is how it behaves. We can change different tabs here. And on the right, this is what your Merge components look like. So we didn't have to code any, we didn't have to add interactions to any of these. This is just out of the box coded coming from the Git repository. Whereas the classic UXPin, we do prototype it in UXPin. Now, if we take a look at the spec mode, there's automated redlining, and in classic UXPin, you can download any of the assets. You have access to the CSS and so on. Now with Merge, you'll be able to, the developers will be able to receive the JSX code that's coming directly from their Git repository. All right, and then now let me go ahead and show you a few examples. So this here is a dashboard that many of you may be familiar with, probably having to design or build in your experience. Now I'm going to go ahead and edit this and show you what it's like to work with coded components. All right, and so actually I have it here already for us. We'll see which tab wins. It's a race. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move down to our, move down here. Okay, and so here we have a bar chart. And this is a coded component. You can tell because there's a icon there. But from here, I can go ahead and change the properties of this. So let's say I want to change the fill from blue to pink. I can go ahead and edit that there. Maybe I want to change the data. I can come here and change this from 8, the first bar on the left. Let's make it something super high, like 32. And then now if I refresh my editor, my chart will auto adjust to fit with that data. So now you can see that, oops, it's now up here at 30 and that changed automatically. So let me zoom back out here and just show you a couple more examples. I'll show you 2 more examples and I'll show you how to access these components. So this card here, you can see that we can change this to a different type of card. So no more designing different states or different static cards. You can come here and just access the cards that is already developed. You can add interactions directly to these coded components as well, and you can have it talk to merge components or even classic UXPin components. And here at the bottom, we have a table that is very fun to prototype. It can be very manual when you are building out a table, but with a merge component that's a table, we can easily add another column and manage that here in this properties, in this property panel with JSON. So I can go ahead and add another instrument, for example, and now that ukulele column will appear here on the right. And so if we take a look at this in the preview mode, it's going to be completely interactive and there's going to be animations built into it. All right, and then here we have our sortable table. And so the last piece that I want to share with you is just how simple it is to access the library. So I'm going to go ahead and do a live demo where I'm pulling components from the library. All right, so I have access to a library here. I'm going to go ahead and just bring out a header. And the header is responsive as well. So let me just zoom out a little bit here. So I can place this at the top and you can see that some icons were added and it's completely responsive. And next I'll bring out a side navigation. Okay, now I can zoom in a bit more. And here I'll place this right there. And taking a look at the layers of it, you can see that this side navigation is actually built with nested components. So we have different list items. With each list item, we can determine if it's going to be a button or if it's going to be collapsed or whatnot. We can also copy and paste them directly into this and it'll continue to grow. And yeah, I just want to show you the capabilities of Merge and UXPin and how this can improve your design ops process by really collaborating, allowing teams to collaborate with your, having both design and development teams collaborate. You'll be using the same single source of truth that is visual, configurable to your design system, and it's interactive and governed. Right, so here we can see all the code that's there. And with that, your design and development team can speak the same language. And I'm going to just end my presentation there. Hopefully this was insightful. And if you have any more questions, definitely write into us. If you start with a trial in UXPin, you'll have access to a material UI merge coded component library that's going to be available until the end of the month. And we do have an upcoming workshop where you can play around with a material UI library as well, and we'll walk you through how to prototype with it. So definitely reach out if you have any questions or if you're interested. Thank you so much for your time, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.